So patterns in nature and their use in permaculture design. Conceptually, we wanted today to look at how we can see patterns, as we discussed this morning, how we see patterns as our teacher, and how patterns basically form a language, and that language is how nature is communicating with us. So we want to try to see if we can go through, by the end of the lesson, use our pattern eye, if you will. Jeff Lawton describes that in a lot of his videos, that if we can see a pattern, people are very good at picking up patterns, and then we're able to see that into a future event, and that'll help us with our designs. From the designer's manual, Bill Mollison, a quote, "Stupidity is an attempt to iron out all the patterns of diversity and not to value them, not to use them creatively." So we want to try to understand why we see replicated patterns in nature. What is that conveying? And why might nature want to use a particular pattern, and what would it do? Hopefully that will help us. So nature is our teacher, and as I described with you guys tomorrow or this morning, that I would like, when the class is done, that you don't refer to "my teacher Bo told me this," or this concept that happens in some other disciplines where people like to form, I don't know, guru aspects of, "but my teacher said this." Nature is your teacher, and if you can learn to appreciate the patterns, at the end you can say, "well, I see this in nature," or I can observe this. This is a direct observation of my intellect with nature. And that would be a much more practical way for you to then take that information into your own design, and you as the owner, operator, or consultant would be utilizing that. So in that instance, we can describe nature, and I prefer to use a feminine description. So her patterns show the flow of her power or life forces. So in these things, we're going to start to look at the patterns, separate them, try to name some of those patterns or different ways to describe them, and functionally see how they're conveying energy. So energy flow in nature. So these patterns show us energy and how it moves. So when you're seeing the pictures of these, that's a delta, the Nile Delta, to the ripples of sand, the synapses in our brains firing, or just a fire, as we had a fire pit the other night. What we're seeing is energy in motion. So the source of that energy on Earth being the sun, and a little geothermal reaction, fusion reactions, generating this movement around us. So when we see this thing, we see energy in motion. So permaculture could be described, instead of a design science, as we saw earlier this morning, but a pattern language. It's the appreciation that we can identify patterns in nature, then we can design from those patterns. So we take and learn this pattern to create some form of new design, and that gives us that way of looking at the world in a different light, so a new way of seeing our environment. So we see the cell structure and the dendritic pattern of a leaf or trees or roots, and then we could see that that might be a more appropriate way for flow to design a city, so that we could flow in and flow out versus what we see today in most cities, the Roman grid. And the Roman grid is a great pattern to control. So it's a very controlling pattern, but it's not very good at flow. So that may have worked really well in the past when we had warring states trying to keep us in walled cities, right? We could control the city very well. But today, that's actually blocking the flow or the dynamic nature of our cities. So we'll see later how people are looking to change those patterns within cities to expand or change the flow within a city, and see how the dynamics or the life of that city would change. Traditional wisdom also used patterns, even where you could see Maoris tattooing their face. There must have been a great belief system to the power that was inherent within the patterns. So people utilizing that in art forms, where stylizations of themselves. Ancient pattern application, where a culture would go as far as to believe that a certain pattern had inherent power and would do large building projects. So this is actually in the US, and this is a snake. It's so large that when you walk onto the berm, you can't tell what it is, okay? So they didn't actually find it until recent times, because they found it with a helicopter. So when they laid it out and got the geometric, it's actually a clock. So it tells them the time of year based on the winter, summer solstices, okay? So that's all of that earthwork would have been done by hand with wicker baskets and people doing that to make that. And easy enough, they could have just driven 3 stakes in the ground and still told what time it was. So their belief system to be able to understand the time or seasons of the year was so important to them, probably to their agriculture, that they were willing to make this, say, monument to it. Phonology is an art form where people would describe that you make a painting and that the painting is telling a story. Typically, these stories have something most of the time to do with what we might call agricultural or hunting, gathering events in that type of art form. So what's going on here and how the people are interacting with animals and plants within a system. So that's a way of conveying a message. So that brings us to what we're trying to do is pattern understanding. So if I see a pattern, first I identify it. Second, if I identify what the pattern is, what is it actually doing? How is the energy moving? And if I can learn to do that, I can learn to interact with the energy flows. So permaculture as an energy capture system, I'm trying to design systems that are going to block, divert, in some way interact with energy. So remember, the longer that I can keep potential energy in my design, the higher the potential yield that I can have. So I can bring sunlight, capture sunlight through leaves as we have trees. That leaf matter can come into composting systems. I can then move the compost to a particular yielding tree, say the mango tree, and I can increase the yield of the mango because of the energy capture. I can increase the yield of the biomass both through water harvesting, right? So I can harvest more water passively with swales, dams, and ponds. And all of these energy capture systems allows me to utilize movement, and today with the advent of solar energy, so I can have a simple solar pump, and I'm able to move the potential energy, the water, from the pond, and I move it to the garden, at which time I can grow vegetables. But without that energy capture, the water, or the energy movement, the solar pump, currently we would be able to grow no vegetables. In Thailand, we might only be able to grow what you would classify as vegetables for approximately 3 months a year. And even that would probably not be capable, because if you go into the market in Thailand during the rainy season, the Thais describe it as the hungry gap. You can't start the seedlings. They get beat down. So when it does rain, it rains so hard, the seedlings will not grow. And when it doesn't rain, well, it doesn't rain. So unless you're carrying the water by hand from a storage, it doesn't grow. So these are things where people started to identify patterns. They started to look at energy capture, and then they can create food production systems. So astronomers, they can model patterns that they find in galaxies, large spirals, so sort of spiral galaxies, so we can model that. Physicists, they can study the movement of atoms, what's happening, so this is another movements. Biologists try to understand the random patterns of growth, so they're looking at animals and how they make grow through their life cycle to understand their successional nature of animals. Meteorologists study the patterns of the atmosphere or climatic patterns, or even modern day climatologists trying to understand how the patterns are related to certain events, maybe carbon release or solar flares or the precession of the equinox, these type of things, and modeling that. Geologists, they study the pattern of the Earth in a geologic time scale, so we can see how the Earth has changed over time. And agriculturalists study the patterns of what? What exactly does the modern day go to university, graduated in agricultural study? The patterns of Monsanto and agro business. Financial patterns, so I know how to figure out the finance for my tractor. Right? You know that the smallest farmer in the United States, corn farmer, has one man has 1,500 acres. Only one employee, himself, and 1,500 acres, and he's almost out of business because that's too small. But don't worry, he has $4 million in debt. So he services a debt of $4 million for the equipment so that he can farm 1,500 acres. Okay, commoditized agriculture. And here we go. What are those circles? What do y'all think those are? Lots of little green dots. Each one's, for scale, guys, 1 kilometer. So one circle is 1 kilometer. Irrigation pivots. So they're use water and irrigating pivots. So the scale of our modern agriculture is something that we don't normally see. It's massive. So that's something we want to look into. And that's not a natural pattern found in nature. Actually, what's really weird is when they use a circle, they create the little negative spaces that we see in white. And each one of those negative spaces can then harbor the insects that then get onto their crops, so they have to fight them off. So if we had a more naturalized pattern, we would be more capable to let nature do these things, which we'll look at more so in the organic agricultural side of permaculture. Even a larger thing, to think about patterns, we also have an issue with only trying to recognize or believe that we live within patterns within our own ego. Our own ego typically holds us to what is our own lifetime. So I can think of patterns within my lifetime, but I don't like to think of patterns past me, generationally, even in thousands of years, 10,000s of years. So if I asked you a question, most everyone would say, hey, I want to plant some fruit trees on my farm. I say, yeah, that's fine, great. After you planted the fruit tree and it lasts 20 years in that spot and it has reached its mature cycle, what do you do next in that spot? Plant another fruit tree and then another fruit tree and then another fruit tree forever? Doesn't sound like that would be a very naturalized pattern. What if the fruit tree after the fruit tree, and that's a 20 years for that fruit tree, then we could go with a root crop, maybe one that sequesters nitrogen. Then a legume tree might be appropriate, and we have legume trees that do produce yield, so we could go with fruit, root, legume. After legume, we could grow a green manure, something like sun hemps. After which, we could grow a vegetable crop, okay, a leafy crop, and then we could replant a fruit tree. But then we'd even have to think about if we had an orchard and we had 100 fruit trees. We really wouldn't want to be in a boom bust, boom bust, boom bust cycle, right? So maybe 10% of our trees each year should be rotating so that the orchard never reaches climax. If it reaches climax, then we'll have the maximum yield, but then our business would go out of business. And if we're in a sustainable business, it's a generational orchard, not my personal orchard. So the maximum I do is plant all my trees on the same day. I get all the yield, I hand it to my children, and they have a defunct orchard, which happens all over the world, by the way. You want to go get some cheap property, just buy an orchard that's 20 years old. The person who's selling it is because he doesn't want to go through it again, and the kids don't want it. A permaculturalist can actually look for that, then cut down or strategically take out some of the trees, use them for shading while we bring up our new trees, to eventually successionally take out every tree. But we'd want to think about that larger rotation, okay? And that rotation would be longer than our lifespans. So that brings us into the concept of scales of organization. So I'll have to throw down tomorrow morning the Raktamachat challenge. Compared to my competitors around the world, I'm going to do more practicals with you on the first morning than they do on their course. I will continue that pace for the rest of the course. They'll do 3, we'll do 36. Sounds like a plan? Because that's the organizational level that we will need to make our farm. That gives us free time. So we are going to look to breaking this down and organizing our work in order to do it in an efficient manner without too much energy exposed, my own, so that I have free time. And if I'm not organized, I'll either work too hard or I won't have any free time or I won't achieve my goals. So my lifestyle goals being I want good food for my family, I want to have meaningful relationships with people, and I want to have free time for myself. I have to, and I always come last in that one. We always say we want to be first, our free time first. Actually, it comes last. So we have to plan our organization to make sure that that doesn't get eroded. So cells to leaves to organisms to sites, towns and cities to regions to states. This is how we organize functionally our societies, our cultures, right, our communities. So we can utilize that same organizational skill within our own agriculture, in our own gardens. The scales of organizations, nations, and the world. So if we can get it right on smaller scales, it's easier to build up those scales from our personal gardens to a local food stabilization or local foods. The slow food movement, right? Farm to table. These type of things is when the smaller scale starts to build up to create and hopefully someday change the world.